All right, everyone, welcome to Where Reality Meets Science. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Rafai, and we have the preeminent professor and doctor, Walter Willett, with us today to talk about something very important in terms of both population and planetary health. Uh, Dr. Willett, in case you don't know, which you probably do, because if you've read any publication there is, from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to Time Magazine or anywhere else, Dr. Willett is known as really the most cited nutrition researcher in world history, and has had a role at Harvard now for how long, Dr. Willett?
Well, one way or another, it's been about 50 years.
Okay. And also, I might add, hails from Michigan and has both well, Wolverine blood and Spartan blood running through him. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Willett, to talk about the Eat Lancet Commission and the work that you have done to guide us towards what would balance both population and planetary health when it comes to food intake. So the first thing I would say, though, is before we get to what is this approach, I would describe as, flexitarian. It's plant predominant, but not plant pure. When it's ethnic agnostic, and it can be applied to, that's my terminology. As we show people this, with this type of eating pattern, if a population that's eating a standard American diet now shifted to this, and you can answer yes or no, expand as much as you wish, could the incidence, severity, or prevalence in any way, shape, or form, mix of those, be decreased for diabetes?
Absolutely. Yes. In fact, combined with other aspects of healthy lifestyle, we see that about 90% of type 2 diabetes could be prevented.
How about atherosclerotic-based disease, which is largely heart attacks and strokes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm going to throw, there's a little bit of a curveball, Doc. How about dementia?
Well, we have more limited data on dementia. Partly it's harder to study, but there's now a large body of evidence that shows that, yes, indeed, we'd have less dementia and better cognitive function, even in the pre-dementia stage.
Well, I mean that's good enough for me. And I might argue, by the way, gentlemen and ladies who are watching, if you're improving your cardiovascular health, you're probably improving your sexual health as well, because erectile dysfunction is really largely or often, I should say, at least, a vascular disease. You don't have to comment on that, but I see you nodding. That's good enough for me, Doc. So I'm going to share a screenshot of excuse me, right here, of a plate that has been shared regarding the Eat Lancet Commission. But as I show this, can you give me a little bit of the history, just a brief history of why was this commission created, and what were the original, maybe what was the original impetus and people behind the commission?
Yes, this commission was started about in 2016 with the realization by many people across the world that we were in trouble, both because of climate change accelerating, global temperatures going up and going up in an accelerating way. And of course, the state of nutrition around the world is deteriorating in many ways. So this commission was developed to answer the question, how could we feed the world, which will be about by 2050, about 10 billion people, a diet that is both healthy and sustainable? Obviously, a huge challenge. So the Wellcome Trust funded this effort, and that allowed us to bring together 35 scientists from 17 different countries to take on this very complicated, challenging question.
So 17 different countries. I'm a big advocate, admittedly, of ethnic inclusivity, or ethnic agnostic, whatever term you want to use. So would it be fair that this is not trying to push any particular ethnic type of approach, but it actually transcends that, and whatever, if you will, spices and flavorings you want to throw in, it can be translated across pretty much any part of the earth?
Yeah, that's right. And basically, human biology is pretty consistent around the world. We can see that within countries, different race, ethnicity groups, but also, of course, across the world as well. And the point is that we've learned enough about the components of a healthy diet that we can see how this can be put together with the flavors and foods from almost every geological context and every culture. Of course, the flavors will be different, and that's great. It gives people variety.
And just to be clear, everybody, I think I will let Dr. Willett speak for himself. I would say that from what I know of him, he's a non-extremist. There isn't a zero tolerance. It's all about dose makes the poison. Whatever you have, I will often say, cake on your birthday isn't the issue. Maybe cake on everyone's birthday is more of an issue. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Okay. So right now, the standard American diet is about how different from this plate. I mean, just, in any words and way, shape, or form you want to describe to the lay community.
Right. We have created a score that measures consistency with this what you would call flexitarian or balanced diet. And I would say, in some ways, just to go back one step, there's a lot of detail there. But in the end, I realized it comes down to something pretty simple. It's about, on average, and it can vary from day to day, about one serving of dairy a day and about one serving of other animal source protein per day, with red meat being not more than about once a week. And of course, that's at a base of whole grains, plenty of fruits and vegetables. So we scored everyone's diet in our follow-up population of about 200,000 people. And the average score out of 140 is just about half of that, somewhere around 70, 75. And that fits with other analyses of the American diet, where another index, the Healthy Eating Index, shows that on a score of 100, Americans are about 50 or 55. So there's huge potential for improvement. That's the good side, the good interpretation of those really bad scores.
And could, for people that are taking step by step, would it be fair to say that you get benefit with every, let's say 10 points? If you went up 10 points, that there would be at least population wide, a measurable improvement. And we're not necessarily saying let's get to 100 tomorrow.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Actually, we published a paper on this last June that I really like, a figure looking at each step. And we had 10 possible steps, and it's very clear every step toward a better diet is going to have important health benefits.
Are there some dairies that you would just focusing on dairy for a second, would you stratify dairy in any way? Is, for instance, Swiss cheese the same as yogurt, as the same as, milk? Maybe just a little bit of a moment on dairy.
Sure. And yes, as you mentioned, I do come from Michigan, and our family farm is still up in Bad Axe there, and our family are dairy farmers for generations going back. So that's a really interesting topic. And scientifically, it's an interesting topic. Basically, with about one serving a day, which I think is a good target for dairy foods in general, it does look like not huge differences in general. There does seem to be some potential added benefit of yogurt, and maybe this is because of the probiotic aspect of yogurt that isn't shared by other foods. A lot of debate about high fat versus low fat. The reality in the end, once you milk that cow, that fat's out there in the food supply, and somebody's going to eat it. And once serving it ate, that amount of fat probably doesn't make much difference.
And that's such a great point, when you're talking about an individual counseling issue and so forth. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about total consumption of all of us in the world as one mouth, those kind of things are really impractical. That's good to know. So yogurt might have a little bit of an edge. Good to know. Regarding legumes, I guess we would put those in the plant-sourced protein area. There's a lot of discussion around blue zones and so forth, and legumes. Could you riff or flex, if you will, on that for a moment?
Sure. Legumes, a pretty broad class of plants. soy is included in that. Peanuts are actually a legume, although just from a culinary standpoint, we usually include them with nuts. But they do share the nice feature about legumes that they actually put nitrogen into the soil instead of pulling it out of the soil. So you don't need to use so much nitrogen fertilizer, which is polluting rivers, lakes, oceans at this point in time. And they come with a good amount of protein as well. But nuts and soy products are particularly good because they do contain a substantial amount of fat, and it's almost entirely healthy, unsaturated fat. And especially soy has a lot of both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in it. So we often think of just beans. Of course, they're a traditional legume in almost every traditional diet around the world. It's pretty amazing. Uh, in terms of legume consumption, I think it's good to have some, again, variety, some soy products, some peanuts, some more traditional beans as well. And again, there are just thousands and thousands of recipes that include legumes. They are the real primary part of the base of almost every traditional eating culture around the world.
Oh, well, I mean, and that's saying something. And from the metabolic perspective, we see potassium with them, we see magnesium with them, we see great fiber to calorie ratios, and they're cooked in water, right? So they're kind of bulked up, still solid and chewy. Yeah, they just seem to our patients seem to really feel full on fewer calories and when legumes are looked at. And you can look at them as a starch or a protein. There seems to be so versatile. Uh,
Yes, absolutely. And one of the reasons that they have all that nutrition in them is that these are seeds, basically, and that young plant that's an embryo sitting there in the germ of that seed needs a lot of nutrition so to grow in its early days. And that it turns out, not by evolution actually, that the nutritional plants of for that little embryo are not that far away from our human nutrition requirements as well. So it's not just one factor, not just certainly not just protein, but it's that whole package of nutritional power that's coming from legumes.
Um, there is a topic that you brought up. I guess we can't. It's kind of a lightning rod, so let's go ahead and discuss it. I know that you and I share perspectives on this, and that is this concept of omega-6 or polyunsaturated fats. And from my laying down the foundation of this, I want to remind the public when you're talking about polyunsaturated fats or essential fats or omega-3, omega-6 fats, they're all the same. So when somebody says that omega-6 is toxic, they are saying that an essential fat that's required for life, linoleic acid, is just has to be had just enough to not kill you, but any more it will kill you. It doesn't make a lot of sense just conceptually, but now that we're seeing the data on it being pretty clear, can we put to rest that polyunsaturated fats, or even particularly omega 6, and maybe the issue is just we need to eat more omega 3, not necessarily less omega 6, but you put your perspectives on the unsaturated and particularly polyunsaturated / essential fats topic.
Right. That's a topic where there is this idea out there on the internet. In fact, I find our medical students are parroting back to me that the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats are toxic. And as you say, Tom, they're absolutely essential. Omega-6 fatty acids comprise a big chunk of our brain and our central nervous system in general. They're part of every cell in our body. And of course, you can get too much of even most of the essential nutrients. They can be unhealthy at some huge amount. But we've looked at this in a lot of detail, and we see as within the U.S. diet, mortality goes down, diabetes goes down, cardiovascular disease goes down with increasing intakes of omega-6 fatty acids. In fact, they seem to be more important than omega-3 fatty acids in the U.S. diet. It does look like most people are getting that sort of minimal amount of omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids, but omega-6 fatty acids keep having health benefits with higher intakes. We can see up to look at about up to 8 or 10% of calories, but there are places where people are getting 15% of calories, like in Taiwan, excuse me, and there people seem to be very healthy as well. So even at intakes well beyond what we're getting in the U.S., omega-6 fatty acids look good, and we've known for decades and decades that they decrease LDL cholesterol in the blood, and we're seeing lots of other health benefits from omega-6 fatty acids as well. In fact, looking in trying to understand why we've reduced heart disease mortality by over 80% in this country since the early 1960s. And we've added about a decade of life. Probably, from what I can see, that increase in omega-6 fatty acids from about 2% of calories in the 1950s to about 7% today, that's been one of the most important contributors to the improvements in health in America.
Exactly. And this whole correlation is not causation. People selectively bring up that the obesity epidemic happened at the same time. Well, we've increased calories. And if anything, yes, maybe we've become too good at mass producing calories, even when they're healthier calories like this. But if we would have increased the calories and maintained beef tallow and saturated fat, I don't think we would have seen, I don't think statins would have been enough to explain the reduction. And, that's my perspective on this.
Statins came along late in the game. We
Oh,
had
right.
already reduced mortality well before, not all the way. They probably continued to help us push down mortality, but with a really big, rapid declines in mortality came well before statins.
Mhm. And was there and because I'm with you, but just to, the skeptics might say, well, but we were cutting down on smoking. Okay, good, but
Mhm.
it certainly didn't make things worse with cardiovascular mortality. Yes, we have a correlation with the obesity epidemic. That's because of overall calorie intake. But one thing that Dr. Mazafarian brought up in a paper he just published was that there's also lesser calorie extraction when you're eating more whole plant foods. That the calorie extraction we've seen, for instance, from whole almonds in a study comparing it to almond butter was less because we just don't have our enzymes can't get into every nook and cranny. I hate to be gross about it, but if you eat corn on the cob, you can often see remnants in your poop in the toilet the next day. This is where it's a medical discussion, everybody. No kids right now. But
Well, kids
the
like to talk about that.
yeah, so true. So I guess it brings me to the issue of whole grains. So there is a spectrum from intact whole grains to made with whole grains. So, for instance, Cheerios versus steel cut oatmeal. Can you just riff, if you will, a little bit on whole grains, which are whole even if they're pulverized? But is there a difference between when they're intact and when they're ground up, not all the way to refined and have the germ and the fiber layer removed and white flour, but again, Cheerios versus, and no, I mean, I eat some Cheerios. I don't want to beat up on any one brand, but the idea is pulverized versus intact.
Right. There are several dimensions and to healthfulness of whole grains, and we're still learning about that. And sort of one dimension is, just as you say, the sort of physical aspect of the whole grain. If it's really whole grain intact, or maybe just sliced one slice like in steel cut oats, the enzymes take longer to get to the starch to break it up into sugar, which it does, turning it into glucose, and eventually. But if you do that more slowly, you get a slower rise in blood glucose levels, which is desirable. So I talk about this as like a whole grain that's intact, like a wheat berry or a steel cut oat. That's like a time release capsule of carbohydrates. So it enters our bloodstream more slowly. And that makes a difference in terms of reducing diabetes risk and risk of cardiovascular disease as well. We call that the glycemic index, essentially quantifying the speed at which the starch gets converted to glucose and shows up in our blood as blood glucose level. But there's the other dimension to whole grains, which is the fiber and nutritional value. And when we refine whole grains, we strip away the bran on the outside and also remove the germ. And we're left with the endosperm, which is almost entirely starch. And that means we've removed about 2/3 of most of the minerals and vitamins that come and fiber that come along in a whole grain. And it's pretty interesting that that's what the milling industry does, is first of all strip away the bran and the and the germ, and leave us with the endosperm, and then usually grinds that up into white flour that has high glycemic index and is depleted in nutritional value. And so what do they do with that germ and bran? Well, they mostly sell it for animal feed because it has such great nutritional value, and they give us the part that is left over. And for the most part, grains in this country are consumed as flour that's been depleted from nutritional value. Yes, it's often fortified. Some of the things are put back in, but certainly not everything. And one other thing we're learning about the benefit of the whole grain and that fiber is, in fact, it's an interesting story that we really couldn't understand why that whole grains look so good. But we do know they lower blood cholesterol, but in terms of heart disease risk, they seem better than you'd expect just by looking at the fiber content. And it turns out that the microbiome is probably involved in that, because that fiber we ingest as whole grains is going to be the main diet of the bacteria that live in our colon. And if they're the right bacteria, the kind that feast on fiber, then there are a lot of good metabolic changes that happen. And it looks like from our sort of overly simplistic perspective a few years ago that the microbiome loop is part of that picture.
Mm-hmm. A healthier gut lining, and I've even read about short chain fatty acids that may actually have a delayed effect on reducing appetite. So why not? And my opinion is that microbiome is more the result of healthy eating versus, and let's say, fecal enemas or taking probiotics, other than if your doctor says so in certain limited fashion. But the idea that we can, by reverse, whether it's a fecal enema or not for C. difficile, that's proven. Mm-hmm. But we're going to have people be thin by taking fecal enemas or popping probiotics. I think it's in reverse. So a question regarding going back to flesh and fish is sometimes I'll describe it as the flesh of choice, but and all of this also throw in portioning too, because some of it is an issue of not just what, but maybe how much. So where does fish fall in, and then poultry, and then a little bit about the portions that we're talking about, or maybe it's the frequency. Maybe if somebody likes to eat a larger mm-hmm. amount, you just have it less frequently, or is that type of thought process involved that a total amount can be either smaller amounts more regularly or larger amounts less often?
Well, we don't have really good data on that last question you asked about. Is it if we're going to have red meat once a week, does that mean a big 12-ounce steak, once a month, or is that any different than having 3 or 4 ounce serving once a week? My guess is it doesn't make much difference in that quite modest level of intake. But in terms of the relative healthfulness of the different animal sources of protein, it looks like, again, there's a spectrum. Red meat is probably or especially processed red meat, on the worst end of that spectrum, but also red meat itself. And that's partly because of what's in it. And that certainly we've known for a long time there's a lot of saturated fat, but also a good amount of cholesterol in red meat, but it's also what's not there. And a lot of people don't realize that there's very little polyunsaturated fat in red meat, healthy fats. But even that little bit of polyunsaturated, a lot of that is trans fat and something we call conjugated linoleic acid that has adverse metabolic effects, unlike the polyunsaturates that we get from plant sources. So there's almost zero healthy polyunsaturated fats in meat. So a lot of the problem is that what's not there as well as what is there. And there's some other effects that we're learning about, adverse consequences of high red meat consumption. Poultry is more in the middle of the animal source of protein. Fish has some unique positive benefits of the omega-3 fatty acids that we get from fish. But there is this, one of the really big unanswered questions still in nutrition is whether the plant sources of omega-3 fatty acids can completely give you all the benefits that the fish sources, the marine sources of omega-3 fatty acids provide. They both provide benefit, but are they really they're gram for gram, they're not equivalent. You get more benefit from it does look like from the marine sources, but it's easier to get omega-3s from plant sources. So the recommendations, American Heart Association, have been for about 2 servings. And these are sort of modest servings, like 4-ounce servings, not 8 or 12-ounce servings of fish per week. That seems like a pretty good target, but we also should really think that this is not just fish, it's other marine food as well. Clams, mussels are environmentally better sources in most circumstances for sources of omega-3 fatty acids than fish. It's a really complex topic, actually.
Well, that's a
And
very good summary, though.
from our Eat Lancet Commission, there was a whole other big commission that's spun off totally to look at what they call blue fluids from aquatic foods from aquatic sources, including even plants like kelp and some other things that actually do. We had a meal as a kelp meal for a demonstration a few months ago. It was pretty interesting that it looks like there's a room for that in our diet and more than we had thought. And kelp can be farmed pretty sustainably, it looks like, in the ocean.
Well, that's very interesting. The conversation wouldn't be rounded out, and here we are wrapping it up without talking a little bit, especially as you mentioned omega-3, about nuts. And are walnuts really the leader now? And I used to think that it didn't really matter which one. Would you give any perspective other than how much is a portion and what role do they play in health, but to any one nut over the other, or two or whatever group that you think might be the leaders?
Yeah, well, that's important. And to point out, not talk about nuts, because when we look at all the foods, nuts come out as the healthiest almost for everything we look at. And not surprisingly, again, they're seeds. They've got all this nutritional value that comes with them, whether it's healthy carbohydrates, healthy fats, minerals, vitamins, fiber, all that's there in nuts. Uh, Among the nuts, most of them seem pretty similar, actually, if you look at the composition. But walnuts do stand out because they do have a pretty reasonable amount of omega-3 fatty acids in them. And when we have looked at different kind of nuts, it does seem like walnuts may have a little bit of an edge. But that doesn't mean that we need to, have all our nuts be walnuts. Again, like so many things, variety is good. Chestnuts are on the other end of the spectrum. They're quite starchy. It don't have all this healthy fat that the other kinds of nuts have. We don't really have any direct evidence about chestnuts. I think they're probably good, but they are, in terms of composition, different than most of the nuts. So again, a variety of nuts is good. And in general, they're environmentally much better than eating beef or even poultry, and as long as we produce them in a healthy way.
Would it be wise to say maybe not necessarily focus so much on the heavily salted versions, maybe try to lean towards maybe lightly?
No, if you actually read the label, that salt and nuts actually don't have a lot of salt in them. A good little yardstick I use is look at the amount, the milligrams of sodium compared to the calories. And as long as there's not more than 1 milligram of sodium per calorie, you could eat all your diet from the salted nuts, and which are almost all of them, less than 1 milligram per calorie, and you'd still be at about 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day, and you'd be eating well within the limits for most people for sodium intake, and about half of the sodium intake in the current American diet. So if you want to have salted nuts sometimes, fine.
Yeah, I love it. Practical label reading with Professor and Dr. Walter Willett, the most cited nutrition researcher ever. Thank you so much for this excellent construct and really context of the Eat Lancet Commission. We're going to be looking forward to more information about it. There's really nothing I can say to thank you enough, Dr. Willett, for what you've done to advance nutritional understanding, and for, by the way, giving a nice shout out to Michigan. Thank you for that, even though we know you're
Okay.
out in Boston now. Thank you so much. You
Well,
have a
thank you.
wonderful day, sir.
Thank you, Tom, for all you do.